the Battle of Midway was a turning point in the war in the Pacific.
The United States doesn't win the war because of the Battle of Midway, but it changes the trajectory of the war. Up until June of 1942, the Japanese were clearly winning.
For years, the Japanese had been rulers of the seas. And at 10:22 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, that changes.
It's very hard to understand why most Americans don't know much about the Battle of Midway or have never heard about it, considering it is such an incredible story involving kind of a very diminutive American fleet going up against a victory-swelled Japanese Navy.
By and large, the first 6 months of the Pacific War went extremely well, even beyond the expectations for the Japanese military. They scored a decisive victory in Pearl Harbor. They also managed to destroy much of the Royal Navy, and their landing in Singapore and the Philippines proved successful.
The Japanese carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, for 6 months, no one has laid a glove on them.
But because of that, they had an inflated view of what they could do. They believed, for example, that 2 of their airplanes could handle 5 American airplanes because their pilots were so skilled.
And there was definite arrogance on the part of the Japanese carrier force.
When Chester Nimitz arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941, it had only been a couple of weeks since the Japanese attack on that infamous December 7th. And of course, what he saw as he flew in were the wrecked hulls of battleships lying on the bottom.
The state of the United States Navy when Nimitz took over was flat on its back. I mean, they had just suffered the worst defeat in our history. When you get to the headquarters in Hawaii, there's a sense of defeatism that permeates much of the United States Navy.
I don't envy the new commander. It's me, isn't it?
And Nimitz was able to turn around that attitude by the force of his personality without yelling, without screaming, without firing people.
Welcome to the most difficult job in the world.
Which I think is a credible testament to his leadership skill.
Nimitz recognized immediately that what the pre-war planners had assumed would be the striking force of the United States Navy had been wrecked. But he also recognized that the real striking arm of the United States Navy were its aircraft carriers that had not been in Pearl Harbor on December the 7th.
I want Enterprise to join Yorktown and Lexington in the Coral Sea.
So one of the first things he decided to do was that he would use his carriers as a striking force. Nimitz's counterpart in the Japanese Navy was Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, who was something of a gambler, a risk taker. He didn't mind taking on those in the Army, for example, with whom he disagreed. That could be dangerous in Japanese society. People who disagreed with the Army got assassinated.
The idea of launching a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor was his brainchild.
Incoming!
Against the more conventional thought of the Naval High Command.
He insisted on the Pearl Harbor attack, threatening to resign unless the Navy General Staff went along with his plan.
And the success of the Pearl Harbor attack greatly increased his prestige and reputation within the Japanese military.
君には私たちが先日話し合った作戦の計画を立て始めてほしい。Midwayですね。
Yamamoto's grand plan for Midway was to draw out the American carrier forces and annihilate in a decisive battle.
He was very disappointed that the attack on December 7th had missed the carriers. His plan then was to attack something the Americans valued, something that would compel them to commit those carriers. Midway fit the bill.
Code breakers are a rare breed. Rochefort's way of doing things is especially particular.
I don't care if he consults coffee grounds while doing the boogie-woogie as long as the intel is good.
Midway was the only campaign in the Pacific War in which code breaking was so fundamental to the event that the battle would not have happened without code breaking.
The whole reason that the American fleet is sent to Midway is on the premise that Captain Joseph Rochefort and his team at Hypo have broken enough of the Japanese naval code that Admiral Nimitz believes it is worth taking this risk.
According to one of my officers, Coral Sea is just a warm-up. He thinks that the Japanese are planning something bigger.
Nimitz was willing to take long chances. Clearly, one option for him is to do nothing at all, to keep his forces away from Midway, a couple of small islands out in the middle of the Pacific. How important could it be? Or, given the fact that he did know something about the Japanese plan, he could commit his resources to take on the Japanese. It was an extraordinarily bold decision.
And instead of sort of taking the bait, we gathered our forces at Midway and we were waiting to ambush the ambushers.
Both sides committed a number of submarines to this battle, but the only submarine that actually mattered in this battle was the USS Nautilus.
The Nautilus was attacked by aircraft, by depth charges, and persisted in pressing their attacks against the Japanese fleet.
And Admiral Nagumo ordered one of their destroyers to stay behind and keep this submarine down so it can't chase us. And that destroyer was the Arashi. And that destroyer, she was hightailing it back to where the Japanese carriers were going.
But all the time that the Nautilus was being pinned down at 140 feet by the Japanese Arashi, the bombing squadron from the Enterprise was heading toward the coordinates where the Japanese were supposed to be. When he arrived at those coordinates, there was nothing there. McCluskey then, the commander of that bombing group, began to conduct a box search. And he finally saw one ship, a single destroyer, but it was heading northward as fast as it could go at 30 knots, leaving a bright white streak behind it, almost like an arrow, pointing to where the Japanese carriers were located.
What do you want to bet she's trying to catch up with the carriers?
The first carrier aircraft from the U.S. to attack the Japanese were 15 torpedo bombers of Torpedo 8. They got there first with no fighter escort. They're low, they're slow, they're facing 30 Japanese Zero fighters, and they get slaughtered. Before they launched, the skipper said, if only one plane is left, I want that plane to go in and get a hit. And that's exactly what they did. Not one of them turned away. And George Gay was the last one in.
He, by himself, treading water in the middle of the Japanese fleet, was able to watch much of what subsequently happened, and therefore gives us the only eyewitness account that Nimitz or anyone else was to have of that battle.
Up to about 10:20 a.m. that day, the Japanese were winning the war.
The Americans had sent out more than 90 planes to attack them. They had not managed to land a single torpedo or a bomb on a single Japanese ship. They had driven off or shot down all of the American torpedo planes.
They had attacked Midway Island, done tremendous damage. They had an invasion force bringing troops to land and take over the island.
But then at about 10:24 that morning, while the planes down on the hangar deck were being rearmed for an attack on the American carrier, the Japanese did not realize that at 20,000 feet, almost directly overhead, the American dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown were arriving.
McCluskey makes the decision to follow the destroyer.
God damn it, that magnificent son of a bitch actually found them.
And by sheer chance arrives over the Japanese carriers at the same time as the one squadron from Yorktown arrived. So both the dive bomber squadrons started diving on the same aircraft carrier. According to doctrine, the lead squadron is supposed to take the fire target and the trail squadron is supposed to take the near target. Both squadrons went after the near target, which was the Kaga.
What the hell? McCluskey was supposed to go for the far carrier. Stay on me.
But Dick Best recognized what had happened at the very last second. So only 3 planes from his squadron were left to attack the Japanese flagship, the Akagi.
The way the dive bombers make their attack is they form into a long string.
They'd fly at about 20,000 feet, which is about 4 miles above the ocean.
The squadron commander rolls into the dive, and then one by one, the other dive bombers follow, and they go down at about 80 degrees to the earth, and they plummet at about 275 miles an hour.
They're going from cold altitude to warm altitude.
You have to keep your hood open, because if you keep it closed, then it fogs up. And then the pilot, he has to do two things. He has to sight the target in a spot on the ocean where he expects to see his target at the end of his dive. And the other thing that you are doing is you are watching the altimeter spin.
3,000! 2,000!
All the while, the enemy is shooting at you with anti-aircraft fire, or you're being chased by combat air patrol fighters.
And this is all going through a pilot's head as they head toward the ocean, as they head toward where they hope that that ship is going to be.
And then when they reach their release point, which is about 2,000 to 1,500 feet above the target, you grip the bomb release lever. It's on the left side of the cockpit. The plane is going to give a huge jolt as the bombs come loose, because you're dropping 1,000 pounds of ordnance straight from your plane. And then you got to pull back on the stick, which means the pilot and gunner have to sustain an 8 or 9G pullout.
One of the dive bomber pilots at Midway talked about how he pulled out of the dive at the last second. He actually felt seawater splash into his cockpit.
So you had 28 planes attack the Kaga and 3 attack the Akagi. So Kaga just gets clobbered and she's crippled out of the battle.
Dick Best and his 2 wingmen attacked the Akagi, and Best's own 1,000-pound bomb landed square on the deck of the Akagi. Penetrated to the hangar deck and exploded, where, on that hangar deck, were 18 torpedo planes fully fueled, fully armed with 1,800-pound torpedoes, and that initial explosion cooked off not only the ordnance that was stacked there, but also the aviation fuel that spread flames throughout the ship, so that even though a carrier under ordinary circumstances should survive a 1,000-pound bomb hit, the Akagi was doomed by that one hit by Dick Best.
That was a beauty, sir!
When the dive bombers got back to their aircraft carriers at the end of the morning attack, that's the moment when they realize that they had this incredible victory, but it comes with a terrible cost.
There is a stillness, a quietude that pervades the ship that is very eerie and surreal. The squadron tables that are on the mess deck are empty. You see the men's caps and leather jackets hanging quietly on the coat hooks.
And the job of many of those pilots is to pack up all of the personal belongings for the men who have not returned.
The Battle of Midway would represent probably the most decisive 5 minutes in the history of warfare. The change from the slaughter of U.S. torpedo bombers, one squadron after another, with the Japanese, frankly, on the verge of victory, and then to have the U.S. dive bombers roll in, take out 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Totally changed the course of the war.
The heart of the Japanese Naval Air Force was gone, and they would never mount a serious offensive again.